The toast was drunk. The moment passed. But the silence that followed was different. It was thoughtful. A community had just publicly celebrated a union it had once condemned. A personal joy had been acknowledged as communal hope. They were not toasting a birth. They were toasting an idea. The idea that the future could be built, piece by piece, meal by meal, in a room where everyone had a seat at the table. The past was acknowledged, but the glass was raised to what came next. The memory crystal sat on a shelf in their living quarters, its light a quiet, constant glow. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The weapon had fired. The threat was gone. Now it was just a powerful, dangerous artifact with no clear role. The debate about its future was brief but sharp. Some of the station's new security advisors argued it should be kept, a strategic asset locked away for the next emergency. Others, their voices still colored by fear of what they didn't understand, called for its destruction. They called it a hazard, an unstable relic of a dead culture. Lena watched the argument swirl around her. She saw the fear in their eyes when they looked at the crystal. They still saw only the weapon. She proposed a different path. She suggested moving the crystal to Blue Hearth. Not to hide it, to display it. She wanted to place it in the center of the restaurant on a special stand, where everyone could see it. It would be art, it would be education, it would be a memorial. Thomas supported her immediately. He understood that a weapon you put on display is a weapon you choose not to use. She spent nights reprogramming its interface. She didn't remove the tactical data or the schematics. She layered them. She built a new access menu. Now a gentle pass of the hand could call up not just a harvester ship's engine specs, but also the delicate swirling patterns of Neelian visual art that had inspired its form. The complex frequency that had saved them was now paired with the symphony that once celebrated a Neelian harvest festival. The grim data streams from a world's final hours were accessible beside recordings of its children laughing, its poets speaking, its oceans washing against shores that no longer existed. The crystal became a window, a library of a life that was over. At first, the Draki customers gave it a wide berth. They would glance at it nervously, then look away. It represented a culture they had dismissed, a technology they had mocked, a defeat of their old leadership. But curiosity is a powerful force. A Draki engineer waiting for his order finally gestured at the crystal. The image of a complex Neelian engine part was floating beside a musical score. He watched, fascinated, as the two seemingly unrelated things interacted, the music influencing the engine's efficiency rating in the simulation. He called his colleagues over. Children were the first to approach it without fear. They saw the beautiful lights, the dancing images. They learned the simple gesture controls quickly. A human child and a young Draki spent an afternoon together, not speaking, just exploring the crystal's layers. They listened to Neelian folktales. They watched holograms of strange, six-legged animals grazing on plains of purple grass. They were learning about a world they would never visit from a people who were gone. They were building empathy from memory. Thomas watched this happen. One evening, he brought a data chip to Lena. It contained his own contributions. Scans of photographs from Earth, recordings of old terrestrial music, schematics of early human flight and poetry from centuries past. He asked her to add them to the archive. She integrated the files, weaving them into the existing tapestry of Neelian culture. The crystal was no longer just a record of loss. It was a living, growing fusion of two worlds, a dialogue between the living and the dead. The weapon had become a teacher. The artifact had become a bridge. It sat in the center of the room where people shared meals and conversations, a quiet, luminous heart. It held the pain of a world's end and the hope of a future built from many beginnings. It asked no questions. It simply offered its stories to anyone willing to learn. The dead were not silent. They were speaking through light and sound, educating the living, ensuring that their end was not in full stop but a seed planted in new soil. The last customer left. The door to Blue Hearth hissed shut. The ritual was simple. Thomas secured the heavy lock. Lena wiped down the counter one last time. Alex powered down the display menus. The silence that settled over the restaurant was not empty. It was earned. It was the quiet of a day's good work completed, a shared space protected and maintained. This was their cherished routine, the final peaceful act before the walk home. Helios Station still held its dangers. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight. In the dimly lit corridors, they passed a group of Draki whose narrowed eyes and muttered comments were a familiar, ugly music. But the tension was different now. Thomas didn't reach for a weapon. Lena didn't lower her gaze. Alex didn't calculate escape routes. They simply walked a unit, a united front. Their quiet confidence was its own shield. The hostility washed against them and broke apart, having nowhere to land. The sectors they walked through had changed. The same grimy corridors, the same humming power conduits, the same distant shudder of docking ships. But the feeling was new. The shopkeeper at the corner stall nodded to them, a brief gesture of recognition. A human couple eating at a street vendor's cart offered a smile. This was no longer hostile territory. It was their neighborhood. They had built a place within it, and that act had reshaped the space around them. They belonged here. Lena's hand rested on the swell of her stomach. Beneath her palm, a small, firm pressure pushed back. A foot, an elbow? The movement was a secret signal from the future, a promise of the life growing inside her. Each kick was a reminder that their story was still being written, that the next chapter was already on its way. She smiled, a private thing she shared only with the cool, recycled air of the corridor. Thomas carried a small sack. It held the day's earnings, a modest collection of credit chips. But it also held other things. A small hand-carved toy from a Draki woodworker, a thank you for a meal that reminded him of his home cluster, a data chip from a Nilian refugee containing a family recipe she wanted Lena to try. They weren't payments. They were gifts, tokens of a community they had helped create, one plate of food at a time. Alex walked a few paces ahead. His posture was relaxed, his head was up, his eyes scanning the corridor not for threats but out of simple awareness. He was no longer the guarded teenager who slept with a shock rod. He was a young man, confident in his place, sure of the family at his back. He was their scout, their lookout, their first line of defense, and he wore the role with a quiet pride that needed no announcement. Somewhere in the deep black, the harvester threat remained. A dormant danger, a problem for another day, but that day was not today. Tonight, the only sound was the hum of the station and the rhythm of their footsteps on the metal deck plating. The silence was a blanket, a temporary peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. Lena slowed her pace slightly, letting her shoulder brush against Thomas's arm. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the low light. "You know," she said, her voice soft. "It works for me, too." She repeated his old tired phrase, the words he'd used when he had nothing left to give. But now, filled with the weight of a home, a family, a future, they meant something entirely new. They were an affirmation, a statement of completion. Their victory wasn't in the battle or the broadcast. It was in this the quiet walk home, the shared silence, the feeling of a hand in yours, the kick of a child yet to be born. After surviving annihilation, after facing down prejudice and galactic threats, they had built a simple, profound thing. A life, a contentment that required no fanfare. It was the most valuable thing in the universe, and they had built it together. It worked for them. Thomas Clark arrived at Helios Station carrying nothing but the weight of his past. He found more than a purpose. He found a family built across star lines, a love written in shared silences and cooked meals. Their story reshaped a station's future. It proves that saving a galaxy can start with a simple act, a shared meal, a offered hand. The most universe-changing revolutions begin with the smallest choices. To care, to protect, to love beyond any boundary. What ordinary act of courage might you choose today? It could change everything. Every biology text, every xenogenetic study stated it plainly. Human and Nilian DNA were incompatible. Their basic protein structures were too different. Their cellular replication processes operated on fundamentally divergent principles. Conception was a biological impossibility. A child couldn't happen. Yet the scan hovering between them showed a healthy embryo, its unique genetic signature a clear fusion of both parents, a living contradiction to a century of scientific consensus. Thomas looked at the shimmering image. He saw the curve of a tiny spine, the flicker of a nascent heartbeat. This was not just a child. This was a statement, a living, breathing rebuttal to every law and prejudice that said their love was wrong, that their species were meant to be separate. Their private joy was suddenly a public fact that defied the known universe. The news spread through the station's gossip networks faster than any official broadcast. It created a ripple of shock. Some called it a miracle, a sign of new beginnings after the harvester threat. Others, led by a furious elder Krath, called it an abomination, a perversion of natural law. He demanded the pregnancy be terminated for the safety of the station, but the scan didn't lie. The impossible was happening. Their love, forged in shared survival and quiet understanding, had created something the galaxy said couldn't exist. In a place built on walls and divisions, their child was the ultimate bridge, a living proof that the deepest barriers were not made of biology but of fear. This child, not yet born, was already their most powerful argument for a different future. The old leadership was disgraced. The stark failure of the Draki Council to protect the station, contrasted with the success of the alien superstition, created a vacuum. A quiet power shift occurred in the weeks after the Harvester retreat. People were angry. They were also curious. In that space of upheaval, Lena saw an opening. Not for power, for a table. She wanted to build a place that served the food of both her worlds, a living monument to the fusion that had saved them all. They converted their apartment. The reinforced door remained, but now it was open to the public. They called it Blue Hearth, for the distinctive root vegetable that had fueled their first real meal together. It was a restaurant. It was also a statement. The main room held their old dining table, now surrounded by others salvaged from station surplus. The kitchen was open so everyone could see Lena work. She hired her first staff carefully. They weren't from the established guilds. They were Draki who had broken with Elder Krath's traditionalists, individuals who valued skill over purity. It was the station's first fully integrated workforce. The menu was the heart of it. Lena took Earth comfort food and reimagined it through a Nelian lens. She created a meat pie seasoned with sharp citrusy Nelian spices that lingered on the palate. She served a rich, creamy soup made from blue hearth roots and topped with crispy salted protein shreds. Every dish was a conversation between two cultures, a delicious argument against separation. Thomas managed the door and the security systems, his presence a quiet assurance of order. Alex handled the technical side, syncing the ordering system with the kitchen displays and managing the environmental controls to keep the air perfect for both species. It was a true family business, each of them contributing their specific, hard-won skills. At first, customers came out of sheer curiosity. They wanted to see the human Nilian couple, the miracle child growing in Lena's belly, the place that had defied the council. They came for the spectacle. They returned for the food. The aromas that drifted from the open kitchen were impossible to ignore. The flavors were unlike anything else on the station, familiar enough to be comforting but new enough to be exciting. But more than the food, they returned for the atmosphere. The Blue Hearth had a feeling. It was the feeling of their apartment multiplied, a sense of calm safety. Conversations started that had never happened on Helios before. A Draki engineer, his scales still dusty from a shift in the maintenance bays, found himself explaining torque settings to a human trader over a shared plate of spiced bread. A Nilian refugee, one of the few who had begun to cautiously emerge, debated the merits of different star charts with a group of off-duty station security officers. Prejudices and old grudges were checked at the door with the coats. It was hard to hold on to hatred while sharing a meal that was so clearly made with care. The simple act of eating together became a neutral ground, a demilitarized zone where people could meet as individuals, not as species. They had tried to reason with the council and failed. They had presented facts and been ignored. But here, with a plate of food and a shared table, they were achieving what politics never could. Diplomacy happened not in a stone chamber with raised voices, but over steaming bowls of soup and the gentle clink of cutlery. The kitchen, which had started as a place of survival for two people, had become the engine of social change for an entire station. Food became their common language, their peace treaty, and their most effective weapon against the old ways. The Blue Hearth wasn't just a restaurant. It was the heart of a new Helios beating slowly and surely, one meal at a time. The air in Blue Hearth was thick with the aroma of spiced bread and simmering broth, a warmth that fought back the station's eternal chill. Every table was full. The crowd was a mix of species, a sight still unusual enough to feel significant. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation died as Marin Tash, the station's new council leader, entered. He moved through the room with a calm authority very different from his predecessor's rigid pride. He stopped at the main table where Lena and Thomas stood. The baby was a visible curve beneath Lena's apron, a silent guest of honor at their own celebration. The room held its breath. Supporters smiled. Skeptics watched from the edges of the crowd, their faces unreadable. Tash raised a glass of dark, effervescent Nelian wine. The gesture was simple, but it commanded the entire room. His voice carried easily over the silent tables. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to Lena and Thomas directly. To new life for new times, he said, his gaze resting on Lena's stomach. The words were simple. They landed in the quiet room with the weight of a prophecy. Then he turned his attention to the assembled guests, his expression sober. This station has a history of looking at difference and seeing threat. We have valued purity over strength, tradition over survival. We were wrong. He acknowledged the prejudice not as a vague concept, but as a specific failure of his own administration's predecessors. It was a stunning public admission. He looked back at the couple. Their courage in the face of our ignorance, their refusal to be separated by the walls we tried to build, shows us a better way. This child they've created is not a dilution. It is a fusion. It is proof that true strength lies in the combination of what is different, not in the isolation of what is the same. He held his glass higher. Around the room, glasses were lifted. Even the most reluctant of the old guard, those who had once sided with Elder Krath, slowly raised theirs. It was not a joyful gesture. It was an acknowledgement, a concession to a change that was already happening, with or without their permission. The battle was over. They were raising a glass to the victors. Lena stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried the same quiet authority she used in her kitchen. She held up her own glass, but she did not tilt it. In my culture, a toast is a shared breath, she explained. We do not drink to the future. We breathe it together. We take the air of this moment and make it part of us, a promise to carry it forward. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Then she raised the glass and sipped. The crowd, human and Draki, and the few other Nilians followed her lead. The ritual was alien, but its meaning transcended species. It was about unity. A shared moment. Thomas spoke last. He wasn't a man for speeches. His words were few, rough-edged. I came here with nothing but a gun and a lot of empty space, he said, his hand finding Lena's. I found a family in the last place I thought to look, in the last person I expected to need. He looked at Alex, at Lena, his meaning clear. This place, he said, gesturing to the restaurant, to the station beyond, it works for me. He used his old, tired phrase, but it was filled with new meaning. It was no longer about settling. It was about belonging. The first thing Thomas did when they moved in was watch Alex. The teenager had been a coiled spring of alertness in the old berth, his hand never far from a shock rod, his eyes constantly tracking the single entrance. Here in the solid, locked space, his shoulders dropped. He left his room door ajar. He set his weapon on a shelf instead of under his pillow. 4 walls and a strong door. They weren't just a shelter. They were a container. A space where the 3 of them could finally exhale and become something new. A family. Alex measured his life in deployments and evacuations. He didn't mark birthdays. He remembered the fall of outposts, the retreat from contested orbitals. His internal clock was set to threat assessments, not school terms or holidays. When Lena entered their new apartment, he watched her with the cold, analytical focus of a soldier surveying a potential hostile. He cataloged her movements. Her silence felt tactical. He expected a request, a demand, some hidden agenda to reveal itself. He waited for the other boot to drop. He kept his door shut and his datapad closed, a shield against an unknown variable. The cracked screen on his pad was a relic from a rushed evacuation months prior. It flickered under stress, making ship schematics and navigation charts difficult to read. He never mentioned it. It was just another piece of broken gear in a broken life. One evening he left it charging on the common room table. He returned to find Lena holding it. His instinct was to snatch it back, a surge of defensive anger rising. But she wasn't searching his files. Her slender fingers were tracing the fine hairline fractures in the display, with a technician's gentle precision. Without a word, she produced a small kit from her own belongings. Fine tools, a tube of clear conductive gel. She worked for 20 minutes in complete silence, her focus absolute. When she handed it back, the screen was smooth and clear, the flicker gone. She hadn't asked. She had simply seen a problem she could fix. The next day, she showed him a game. She drew a grid of Nilian numerals on a scrap of synth paper. Her movements quick and sure. It looked like a simple puzzle, matching sequences. But as she explained the rules in her quiet voice, Alex saw the underlying pattern. It was a cipher. The sequences corresponded to basic encryption protocols, the kind used in low-level ship-to-ship comms. It was a counting game that taught mathematical logic and data security. He played, his suspicion giving way to focused curiosity. She never framed it as a lesson. It was just a way to pass the time. Thomas watched the change from a distance. He saw the rigid line of Alex's shoulders begin to soften. The boy's eyes, which had constantly darted to check the apartment's single door, now stayed fixed on the game grid, or the simmering pot on the stove. The hyper-vigilance that had been his default setting for years was slowly powering down. One evening, Thomas realized Alex's bedroom door was open a few inches. The next, the boy didn't retreat to his room after eating. He lingered at the table watching Lena clean up. Then he stood and started clearing plates without being asked. He didn't speak much, but he was there. Present, Lena never pushed. She never asked for his trust. She just offered quiet competence and unwavering calm. Her presence in the room became like a gravity well, steadying his turbulent orbit. The apartment stopped feeling like a temporary bunker and began to feel like a center. Alex's internal calendar began to reset. He stopped counting the days since the last security alert. He started to notice the rhythm of their shared meals. The rich, spiced stew on a cold cycle. The sharp, bright flavor of the citrus fruit she managed to find at market. He began to mark time by what was on his plate, by the company across the table. For the first time since he could remember, the primary sensation wasn't fear. It was the novel, unfamiliar feeling of safety. He was learning to measure his life in something other than survival. The steam from the blue root soup fogged the kitchen window, blurring the hard lines of the station's outer hull. It was a quiet meal. The only sounds were the gentle clink of spoons and the distant, regular hum of the environmental systems. Lena had coaxed rich, earthy flavors from the strange Helios tubers. Another small miracle performed at their stove. Alex blew on a spoonful, the warmth a comfort against the ever-present chill of space. He looked at Lena, his expression not wary for once, but simply curious. He asked the question that had likely been forming for weeks. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the steam. What was your world like? Why did you leave? It was an innocent question. A boy asking about a home, assuming it was simply a place one moved away from for better opportunities. Lena set her spoon down with a precise click. She didn't look away. Her large, dark eyes held a distance that had nothing to do with the room. When she spoke, her voice was the same calm, measured tone she used to explain a recipe. But the words were not about food. The atmospheric processors failed first, she said. Her fingers traced the rim of her bowl. They were the oldest on Nelia. The readings spiked off the charts. The sky turned the color of rust. Then the oceans began to boil. She listed the events with a clinical detachment that was more chilling than any scream of terror could have been. There was no emotion in the recitation of facts, just a horrifying sequence of cause and effect. The harvesters do not conquer, she continued, as if explaining a fundamental law of physics. They do not occupy. They consume. They strip a world of every usable resource. Every mineral, every liter of water, every joule of energy. They leave nothing but cold rock and silence. Thomas froze, a piece of tuber halfway to his mouth. The soup suddenly tasted like ash. He knew this pattern. He'd seen it from the edge of mapped space for years. A cold dread in the pit of his stomach every time a mercenary briefing mentioned a system going quiet. A colony would stop transmitting. A trade route would report no traffic. Scouts would be sent. They would find empty worlds, scoured clean, atmospheres gone. The official reports always blamed catastrophic geological events or unknown stellar phenomena. The unofficial chatter among fighters like him always used a different word. A whisper. Harvested. His eyes met Lena's across the table. The quiet competence he admired, the profound calm she carried, it all took on a terrifying new dimension. This wasn't just the resilience of a refugee who'd lost her home to a war or a disaster. This was the stillness of a survivor who had walked through the absolute end of everything. She had lived through planetary annihilation and carried its blueprint in her mind. The comfortable kitchen, the warm food, the safe walls, it all felt suddenly fragile, thin. The realization was a cold knot in his gut. Helios Station was a rich source of metals, technology, and biological matter. It was a floating bounty of resources. If the harvesters were operating in this sector, their peaceful dinner table had just become a strategic briefing. The unspoken threat now had a name, and it hung in the air. A ghost at their meal, its appetite infinite. Every conversation from that night forward would happen in its long, cold shadow. Weeks passed. The threat of the harvesters became a background hum in their lives, a constant low-grade tension beneath the domestic rhythm of shared meals and quiet evenings. Lena watched. She measured their trust not in words, but in actions. The way Thomas left his weapon unloaded on the shelf. The way Alex left his datapad unlocked on the table. One night, after the dishes were cleared, she went to her small trunk of belongings. She returned holding an object that seemed to catch and hold the room's light. It was a memory crystal, about the size of her palm, its facets throwing sharp prismatic shards of blue and silver across the walls. Thomas expected something personal. A family portrait, a recording of a song, a last image of a world he could never see. He was ready to offer the respectful silence such a moment deserved. Lena placed the crystal on the table. Her fingers traced a specific sequence on its cool surface. The air above it shimmered, and a three-dimensional tactical display flickered to life. It wasn't a memory. It was a war room. Ships, Nelian defense vessels, sleek and fast, were arrayed in complex shifting formations. Data streams scrolled beside them, showing power outputs, weapon status, shield integrity. The projection zoomed in on a harvester ship, its ugly, blocky architecture rendered in perfect, terrifying detail. Schematics unfolded next to it, highlighting propulsion systems, potential structural weaknesses, energy conduits. Another gesture from Lena, and the display shifted to atmospheric graphs from Nelia's final hours, showing the lethal spike in toxic particulates, the catastrophic drop in pressure. It was a clinical, horrifying autopsy of a planet's death. The dust of Helios Station clung to Thomas Clark's worn jacket as he stepped off the transport. Another day in a long line of mercenary jobs. But when he saw the starving Nilian girl being harassed by Draki merchants, something in him broke. He paid for her meal with his last credits, not knowing this single act of mercy would redefine his entire existence. Helios Station smelled of recycled air and desperation. It was the kind of place people ended up when they had used up all their other options, a final stop before the void. For Thomas Clark, it was simply another contract. Another job in a line of them that had blurred together into a gray smear of survival. His military pension had dried up years ago, siphoned away by medical bills and bad investments. The good gear was long since pawned, replaced by whatever he could scavenge or afford. The fire that once drove him was just cold ash now, banked by too many losses on too many battlefields. He moved through the crowded market sector with the weary gait of a man who expected nothing. The Draki merchants stood out like vultures in a flock of pigeons. Their scales held a dull, oily sheen under the harsh station lights, and their postures radiated a predatory arrogance. They were the kind who profited from misery, turning desperation into a commodity. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew their type. He'd fought their type. He was trying to ignore them, to just get to his rented berth and sleep when he saw the girl. She was Nilian, her gray skin and large, dark eyes marking her as an outsider. One of the Draki shoved her back from their stall, knocking a bruised piece of fruit from her hand. She didn't cry out, just stared at the food on the ground with a hollow hunger that went straight through Thomas's defenses. It wasn't a thought. It was a reflex. Years of training and instinct took over his exhausted body, moving him forward before his mind could object. He stepped between the girl and the merchant, his posture shifting from weary traveler to combat-ready in a single breath. The move was automatic, a ghost of the man he used to be. This wasn't heroism. It was a spasm of a moral compass he'd assumed was shattered beyond repair. The lead Draki sneered, its nostrils flaring at the scent of human. But its eyes dropped to Thomas's hands, to the way he held himself, and it recognized the unspoken warning of a trained fighter. The sneer became a grunt of dismissal. Thomas didn't look at the girl. He pulled the last credit chip from his pocket, the one meant for a hot meal and a real drink, and tossed it onto the merchant's counter. He pointed at a wrapped meal pack. The transaction was silent. He took the pack and handed it to the girl, then turned to leave. He expected nothing. No thanks, no grand change. It was just one less moment of ugliness in an inherently ugly universe. A small, pointless resistance. She followed him, not speaking, just a few steps behind. When he finally stopped and looked back, she met his gaze. He just shrugged. the motion heavy with a lifetime of fatigue. "Works for me," he said. The words were simple, empty, but they landed in the silence between them and became something else entirely. In that moment, the mercenary had spent his last coins and purchased the one thing no contract had ever offered him: a reason to care. Thomas expected her to follow him to his door, maybe murmur a thank you, then disappear back into the station's bowels. Instead, the Nillian girl stood waiting as he keyed open the lock to his temporary berth. Her eyes scanned the cramped space not with judgment but assessment. This wasn't about gratitude. She was evaluating a potential stronghold. Thomas gestured vaguely toward the small food prep area, a cluster of cheap appliances and basic supplies he barely used. He muttered something about her helping herself if she was hungry, expecting awkwardness, uncertainty. He got neither. She moved to the counter without a word. Her gaze swept over his meager stockpile: powdered protein, dehydrated vegetable matter, cheap grain cakes. Her slender fingers touched each container, calculating. She noted the absence of fresh ingredients, the high sodium content of the preservative-heavy pastes, the caloric deficiency in the primary rations. She wasn't seeing food. She was seeing a problem to be solved. Then her hands began to work. She took a sealed pack of synthetic protein, the bland kind issued to station security. She tore it open with a quick, precise motion. A knife appeared from a holster at her thigh, its blade oddly curved. She began to slice. The motion was pure economy. No wasted movement. Each cut was measured. She found a few dried spice canisters he'd forgotten he owned, shaking pinches of ochre and rust-colored powders into a bowl. She mixed them with a few drops of water, creating a paste that filled the small room with a scent that was both alien and deeply familiar. She heated a pan. The protein sizzled as it hit the surface. She applied the spice paste, turning the gray slabs a rich, fragrant brown. In minutes, she arranged the food on 2 plates with a piece of rehydrated green matter and a grain cake. She placed one in front of him. He took a bite. The flavor exploded across his tongue. It wasn't just good. It was memory. It tasted like Earth, like a specific street vendor in a specific city he hadn't thought of in 15 years. It tasted like a home he'd convinced himself was gone forever. He looked at her. She was eating her own portion slowly, her large dark eyes watching him. She asked her first question. Not about him. Not about why he helped. Her voice was quiet, melodic. "Where is the nearest market with fresh tubers?" Then another. "What is your credit allowance per cycle for food?" Practical? Necessary. She was building a system. Thomas understood then. This wasn't just cooking. This was architecture. She was constructing a barrier, a layer of warmth and nourishment against the station's relentless chill, its pervasive indifference. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was focus. Her questions weren't interruptions. They were blueprints. They found a language in the sizzle of a pan, the aroma of spices, the shared act of a meal prepared and consumed. This quiet girl with the kitchen knives didn't just know recipes. She carried the ghost of the entire culinary tradition in her hands, and she was using it to build them both a shelter. The temporary berth near the industrial sector wasn't a home. It was a metal box that vibrated with the station's machinery and smelled of ozone and rust. Condensation dripped from a leaking seal in the ceiling, a constant reminder of their impermanence. Thomas knew they needed better. A real apartment meant security. It meant a door that locked from the inside and life support that didn't depend on the station's failing grid. He approached it like a tactical problem, scouting listings for defensible positions, calculating sightlines from potential windows. It was a military operation. Every viewing was a reconnaissance mission. The prejudice hit them immediately. Landlords who had seemed eager over comms would physically recoil when they arrived. A human was bad enough. A human with a Nillian was a problem. They used phrases like cultural incompatibility and potential for disturbance. One Draki property manager outright stated his other tenants wouldn't tolerate her scent. Thomas's hand would twitch toward a weapon he no longer carried. His old strategies, intimidation, negotiation, failed against this deep-seated bigotry. They were hitting a wall he didn't know how to breach. Then Lena took over. She didn't ask for permission. She accessed the station's public data streams from Thomas's terminal, her fingers flying across the interface. Thomas watched, his security instincts shifting from offense to protection as she worked. She wasn't just browsing listings. She was running a deep analysis. She cross-referenced property records with public security logs, flagging buildings with lower crime rates and responsive patrol routes. She pulled structural integrity reports dismissing anything newer and flimsier than the station's original construction. She compiled dossiers on landlords, noting who had histories of tenant disputes or erratic behavior. She was building a target profile. Thomas provided the security. He stood guard during viewings, his presence a silent deterrent to anyone who might consider causing trouble. He checked sightlines, tested door frames, assessed escape routes from every potential unit. They became a team, her data, his instinct. They found a place in a quiet, older sector. The door was solid metal with a heavy manual bolt to supplement the electronic lock. The life support unit was a standalone model, capable of recycling air and water for weeks if the main systems failed. It was perfect. The landlord, a grizzled old human mechanic with grease under his nails, seemed indifferent to Lena's presence. He gave them a flat, hard stare and named a price that was twice what they could afford. Lena stepped forward. She didn't plead.
She negotiated.
She cited the property's outdated electrical conduits, the lack of recent pressure hull certifications, the distance from central security. She spoke in calm, factual terms, her voice steady. She pointed out that a reliable, long-term tenant who could perform minor repairs was better than an empty unit. Thomas watched her, and for the first time he didn't see a refugee. He saw a survivor. This was a skill forged in a much harder crucible than a kitchen. She had done this before, under circumstances he could only guess at. She secured the lease for half the initial asking price. She found the files in a partition marked with Nelian symbols for navigation. They weren't theoretical designs. They were battlefield captures, sensor logs from the final desperate hours over Nelia. The data was raw, chaotic, a record of a civilization's last breath. But within the chaos was a pattern, a consistency. Every harvester ship, from the largest command vessel to the smallest drone, transmitted a specific resonance frequency on a tight beam. It was their navigational heartbeat, the signal they used to hold formation and navigate the complex gravity wells of a system under siege. It was a flaw, a single point of failure. To disrupt that frequency would be like hitting a human with a sonic weapon aimed at the inner ear. It wouldn't destroy the ships. It would disorient them utterly. Their perfect formations would shatter. Their precise courses would become erratic, drunken spirals. They would be blind and unstable, turning a coordinated armada into a chaotic swarm of individual hazards. Thomas looked up from his own work as she explained it. His military mind seized the concept immediately. He didn't see a scientific curiosity. He saw a weapon, a key. Their own modest apartment was just a few sectors away from the station's main communication array. That array was powerful enough to broadcast a signal across the entire Helios system. With the right modifications, it could be tuned to transmit this disruptive frequency. It was a perfect, elegant defense. It used the harvester's own technology against them. The problem was access. The communication array was council property. To even request maintenance access required filing forms, submitting to background checks, getting approvals from a board that was predominantly Draki, the same Draki who had dismissed Lena as a refugee and Thomas as a troublesome human. The council that valued procedure over survival. To present them with this data, this alien science, would be to invite suspicion, not gratitude. They would see a security risk, not a solution. They would want the crystal. They would want to interrogate its keeper. Lena's life-saving knowledge could be the very thing that got her detained, deported, or worse. Her safety was the price of the station's salvation. The crystal sat between them on the table, its gentle light now feeling ominous. Its purpose had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer just a memorial or a library. It was a trigger, a strategic weapon that held the fate of thousands in its facets. The ghost of a dead world had just handed them the means to protect a living one, but using it would require breaking every rule on the books. The knowledge of Nelia's end might be the only thing that could prevent Helios from sharing its fate. The weight of that contradiction settled over the room, as heavy and silent as space itself. The council chamber felt like a tomb lined with cold, polished stone and colder stairs. Thomas stood with Lena at his side, the memory crystal's datapad held between them like an offering. They had rehearsed the presentation. They had the evidence. They had the solution. They expected skepticism. They expected debate. They did not expect the wall of pure, unadulterated contempt that hit them the moment Elder Krath, the senior Draki counselor, began to speak. He didn't even look at the data. His scaled eyelids lowered as he dismissed the pad with a flick of his wrist.
Alien superstition, he declared, his voice a dry rasp.
Fanciful stories from a displaced culture seeking relevance. His gaze, yellow and unblinking, fixed on Lena. This is not science. It is desperation, a fabricated panic to justify your continued presence on this station. He didn't ask questions. He made accusations. He demanded the physical crystal be handed over immediately for security analysis, his tone leaving no doubt that analysis meant confiscation. The other Draki on the council murmured their agreement, a chorus of scaled heads nodding in unison. Their prejudice was a physical force in the room. The idea that Nilian science, the knowledge of a species they considered lesser, could provide an answer they themselves had not conceived, was an insult to their pride. They would sooner believe in fairy tales than in the competence of the gray-skinned woman standing silently before them. Thomas stepped forward. He used his full name, his formal rank from a military they respected. He spoke of verified sensor logs, of tactical patterns observed on the fringe for years. He tried to lend the weight of his experience to the cold, hard data. But his humanity worked against him. To them, he was just another human mercenary, a hired gun prone to paranoia and violence. His credentials were a mark against him, not a validation. His words hit the wall of scaled indifference and fell away, useless. Lena remained calm. She had prepared for this. She produced 2 small maintenance drones from a case, the kind used for cleaning external viewports. She synced them to the datapad. With a few commands, she made them fly in a perfect synchronized formation. Then she activated the frequency. The change was immediate and chaotic. The drones wobbled violently, their precise flight paths dissolving into a lurching, uncoordinated stumble. They bumped into each other, spinning off in random directions until she shut the signal off. It was a perfect small-scale demonstration. Elder Krath leaned back in his seat. A low hiss escaped his throat. A parlor trick, he scoffed. You disrupt toy drones with alien noise and expect us to reconfigure our entire defense grid? This is not a solution. It is a distraction. The session was over. There would be no approval, no access to the array. Instead, there were threats. Official notice of a review of Lena's residency status, with a strong recommendation for deportation. Sanctions against Thomas for bringing a security risk before the council. They were ushered out by armed Draki guards, the heavy doors sealing shut behind them. They stood in the sterile hallway, the silence louder than any alarm. The datapad felt suddenly heavy, useless. The perfect defense strategy was worthless. The council had seen the proof and called it a trick. They had been offered salvation and had chosen pride. The harvesters were a theoretical threat, a problem for another day, but the danger sitting in that council chamber, the deep ingrained prejudice that blinded them to their own survival, was real and present and more immediate than any fleet. They had just learned a terrible truth. Sometimes the enemy isn't the one approaching with weapons. It's the one refusing to pick up a shield. The silence in their apartment was the first warning. It wasn't the comfortable quiet they'd built. This was a violated silence. The door hissed shut behind them. Thomas's eyes swept the room. Drawers hung open, their contents spilled. Access panels to the life support and comms lines had been pried loose, wires spilling out. The careful order of their home had been turned inside out. Lena went straight to the false panel behind the cooling unit. Her hands came away empty. The memory crystal was gone. Her research notes, the detailed frequency modulations, were missing from her datapad. The air left Thomas's lungs. Their sanctuary had been breached. Their only advantage stolen. His military training took over. The shock lasted a second. Then he moved. He barred the heavy manual lock on the door. He checked the charge on his shock rod, the only weapon he hadn't pawned. He positioned Alex at the secondary entrance to the ventilation shaft, handing him a heavy wrench. He gave Lena a sharp kitchen knife, its edge honed to perfection. They didn't speak. They just took their positions. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a defensive point. They waited. They knew the search was just the beginning. They came after Dark Cycle, a sharp official rap on the door. 3 Draki enforcers in station security armor stood in the hall. The lead one held a data slate. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. "Lena of Nelia, you are required for questioning regarding the theft of council property. Come with us." Thomas stood in the doorway, blocking their view inside. He said nothing. His refusal was his posture, his stance filling the frame. The lead enforcer's slitted eyes narrowed. "Do not interfere," they didn't argue. They brought up plasma cutters. The orange-hot tips bit into the metal around the door lock with a shriek of vaporizing alloy. Regulations meant nothing. This was an extraction. Thomas slammed the inner manual bolt home just as the door blew inward. The fight was close, brutal, and short. Thomas used the tight space to his advantage, disabling the first enforcer with a blow to the throat and using the man's body as a shield. Alex didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy wrench into the knee joint of a second enforcer's armor, the crack of braking machinery echoing in the small space. He followed up with a jab from a plasma torch set to low, not to cut but to shock. The enforcer spasmed and dropped. In the chaos of flashing lights and shouting, Lena moved. Not to fight, to retrieve. Her eyes were on the lead enforcer's belt. A familiar prismatic glint caught the light. The crystal. He'd taken it as a trophy. As the enforcer raised his weapon toward Thomas, she ducked under his arm. Her fingers found the release on his belt pouch. She snatched the crystal and rolled away, coming up behind their makeshift barricade. Thomas saw her secure it. That was the signal. He launched himself forward, ending the fight with a final decisive strike. "This contains everything," Lena said, her voice calm but heavy. "Our science, our history, our art, our defense protocols. It was our last act. We did not have time to run. We had time only to save what we were." She demonstrated, her hands moving through the air to control the projections. A flick of her wrist called up star charts. A pinch of her fingers zoomed into the molecular structure of a Nelian alloy stronger than titanium. A flat-palmed swipe brought forth lines of graceful, flowing script. A poem or a prayer, Thomas couldn't tell. The crystal was a library, a museum, and an armory, all contained within its luminous heart. Thomas stared, his mercenary mind struggling to process the scale of what she was showing him. This wasn't a sentimental gesture. It was the transfer of command. This was strategic intelligence of a magnitude that could start or end wars. The Draki High Command would sacrifice entire fleets for a fraction of this data. Corporations would bankrupt themselves. It was the complete technological and cultural output of an advanced civilization, now sitting on his kitchen table. The weight of it pressed down on him. Her trust was absolute, and it was terrifying. She wasn't just sharing her past. She was handing him the soul of her dead people, placing the entire legacy of Nelia into the hands of a tired human mercenary and a scarred teenager. The crystal's light played over their faces. Its purpose had transformed in the space of minutes. It was no longer a memorial. It was a weapon.
A key, a seed.
The combined knowledge of a world that no longer existed was now the most powerful asset in their modest apartment, and its fate was inextricably linked to their own. A dead world's final breath was now their problem to solve. The cleanup was a familiar rhythm, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of their shared meals. Thomas washed. Lena dried. The warm, damp air carried the lingering scent of spices. He reached for the last pot on the drying rack at the same moment she did. His rough, calloused hand, still wet from the sink, brushed against the back of hers. Her skin was cooler, smoother. The contact was an accident, a split second of static. He expected her to pull away. She didn't, he didn't either. The moment stretched, filled with the hum of the life support unit and the faint distant thrum of the station's core. It was just a touch, 2 hands on a pot, but it carried the weight of every unspoken thing between them. Human and Nilian, employer and... What was she now? Partner? Friend? The lines had blurred over weeks of shared danger and domestic peace. The touch lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the rhythm resumed. She took the pot. He picked up a towel. They finished the work in silence, but the air in the kitchen had changed. A boundary had been crossed without a single word. Hours later, the apartment was dark except for the soft blue glow of the memory crystal. Thomas found her in the common area, the star charts of the Helios system floating above the table. She wasn't working, just staring at the patterns of light. He poured 2 glasses of water and brought one over. She took it without looking up. Their conversation started with the charts. The shipping lanes, the blind spots where a fleet could hide. It was safe. technical. But the undercurrent was there, pulling them away from navigation. He asked about her family. Not her world, but her family. She spoke of them in the same calm tone, but it was thinner now, stretched over a deep ache. A mother who was a bioengineer. A father who composed music based on orbital harmonics. She asked about his life before the mercenary work. He told her about a small town on Earth with real sunlight, and the decision to leave it all behind for a uniform that promised purpose. They spoke of regrets, choices made, lives lost, hopes that felt foolish to voice aloud in the dark. She explained then, her eyes on the stars. For her people, touch was not casual. It was a language. A hand placed on another's arm was a question. A shared burden. A brush of fingers could be a promise or a farewell. It was never without meaning. It was the foundation of their bonds, the most sacred and private part of their culture. To offer touch was to offer a piece of your soul. To accept it was to swear protection. He understood the weight of that brief contact in the kitchen. It hadn't been an accident to her. It had been a silent, terrifying risk. He looked at her hand resting on the table. The slender fingers that could build a meal or access a dead world's archives. The space between them felt vast and infinitesimally small. He made the decision, not with a word. He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate. His hand covered hers. It was a question. A complete sentence formed in the silence between two different species. Her fingers moved. Not away, they shifted under his, turning. Her cool palm pressed against his warmer one. Her fingers laced through his, locking their hands together. The answer was yes. In the quiet dark, with the stars of a threatened system shining around them, they found a common language that needed no translation. It was settled. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. Love on Helios Station was not a public celebration. It was a series of stolen moments, a secret shared in the dark. Early mornings found them together in the kitchen, the quiet hum of the food prep unit masking their low conversations. Night watch shifts became a chance to stand together at the viewport, shoulders nearly touching, watching the silent traffic of ships against the starfield. These were the only times they could drop the careful distance they maintained for outside eyes. The station's ever-present surveillance was a fact of life, but lately it felt more focused. Draki patrols made more frequent passes through their sector. Thomas noticed their lingering stares, the way they noted the composition of their household in their logs. They called it monitoring irregular domestic patterns. It was a polite term for suspicion. Lena explained it to him one night. For her people, a bond was the most sacred thing. It was not for public display. To flaunt it was to disrespect the very concept of community, to cheapen something profound. Their love was a private language, spoken in touches and shared silence. Not in grand gestures under the bright station lights. Thomas understood. His military training had been about control, about concealing intention and movement. He adapted those skills to this new mission. Protecting their connection became his primary objective. Every glance, every step, every word in public was calculated to project an image of a standard employer-employee relationship. The truth of them was a secret he guarded more fiercely than any weapon. The station's main power grid chose a quiet cycle to fail. The lights died. The constant background hum of machinery ceased, leaving a startling absolute silence. Emergency strips along the floor cast a weak red glow, painting the apartment in shadows. They were in the common area, frozen in the sudden dark. The only sound was their breathing. Thomas moved toward the life support panel on instinct, checking its independent power cell. Lena was a silhouette nearby. He could feel her presence more than see her. The darkness was total. It was also a gift. It was the one thing they never had. Complete privacy. He found her in the black. His hands touched her arms. She didn't startle. She turned into him. There were no words. There was only the press of her body against his, the cool silk of her hair against his cheek, and then her lips. The kiss was not hesitant. It was an answer to every unspoken question, a confirmation of every silent promise they had made with linked hands. It was a moment outside of time, insulated from the station, from the prejudice, from the looming threat of the harvesters. It was just them, in the dark, finally crossing the last bridge. A soft click broke the silence. The door to Alex's room had opened. A sliver of red light from the hall emergency strip outlined his frame. He stood there for a beat, taking in the scene. Thomas's body went rigid. every instinct screaming to step back, to create space, to protect the secret. But it was too late. Alex had seen. The boy didn't speak. He didn't react with anger or surprise. He simply looked, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and pulled his door closed again. The lock didn't engage. The next day, Alex developed a new habit. A specific tap of his fingers on the table meant a patrol was approaching their door. A certain way of clearing his throat meant the coast was clear. He became their unexpected sentry, their ally in the conspiracy. The station's old hatreds made their love a dangerous liability, a potential excuse for deportation or worse. But within their four walls, they built a fortress of understanding. They spoke in glances across a crowded room, a brief brush of fingers when passing a dish, a hand resting on a shoulder for a second too long. It was a language only the three of them understood. Their love became their most critical, most carefully guarded operation. The crystal's light was a constant companion in the late hours, a cool blue glow that painted Lena's face as she worked. While Thomas pored over schematics of the station's aging defense grid, tracing power conduits and weapon emplacements, she delved deeper into the artifact's core. It was a division of labor born of necessity. He thought in terms of shields and projectiles. She navigated layers of encoded data, each one a deeper stratum of her people's legacy. The common room was silent except for the soft hum of the crystal and the occasional tap of a finger on a datapad. The enforcers lay unconscious or groaning on the floor. The acrid smell of plasma and ozone filled the air. Their door was a ruined, smoldering hole. Thomas dragged the bodies into the hall and sealed the breach with a sheet of alloy from the storage locker. It was a temporary fix. They stood in the wreckage of their home, breathing hard. They had held the apartment. They had the crystal back. But the message was clear. The council wasn't just ignoring them. They were coming for them. Their fortress had held against the first assault, but the war had been declared. Their home was now the front line in a conflict the rest of the station refused to see. The four walls felt thinner than ever. The council had left them no choice. Saving the station was now an act of treason. The plan was a desperate fusion of their separate skills, a final roll of the dice with the highest possible stakes. Alex laid out the schematics. His months of studying the station's engineering underbelly gave them their window. The communication array's maintenance shift changed at Aero 300 station time. The overlap lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes to get in, get the job done, and get out, or get caught. They moved through the service corridors like ghosts. Thomas led, using his security experience to bypass motion sensors and access panels. He didn't disable them. He timed their movements to the regular patrol sweeps, creating blind spots in the system. Alex followed. His datapad synced to the station's internal clock, counting down the seconds. Lena moved in the center, the memory crystal a hard, cold weight in her pack. The air in the narrow passages was cold and smelled of ozone and metal. The control room for the main array was a circular chamber dominated by a massive view screen and a console covered in blinking lights. It was empty. The night shift had just left. The day shift hadn't arrived. Alex went straight to the main terminal, his fingers flying across the interface. He bypassed the safety protocols with a series of commands he'd memorized. Lena didn't wait. She pulled the crystal from her pack. Instead of using a data port, she went for a direct hardware link, clamping the crystal's base directly onto a primary data conduit. It was a brute force method, risky. It could fry the crystal, the array, or both. The screen lit up with the complex frequency modulation data. A bar graph appeared showing the transmission strength. It had to be perfect. Too low and the signal would dissipate into background noise, useless against the harvester fleet. Too high, and the feedback would overload the array's amplifiers, turning their only hope into a smoldering wreck. Alex's hands were steady on the calibration controls. Lena watched the graph, her voice calm as she called out minute adjustments. Increase 0.05, hold, decrease 0.02. A red alert flashed on a secondary screen. Harvester signatures appeared on the long-range scanners. Dozens of them. A coordinated attack group moving at high speed toward the station. At the same moment, the door console flashed. Security teams. They had been made. Thomas backed toward the door, drawing his shock rod. He could hear the heavy tread of armored boots in the corridor outside. They were out of time. The main door shuddered as someone on the other side started a plasma cutter. Thomas braced himself against a secondary console, his weapon held ready. The air filled with the shriek of melting metal. Alex didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the calibration readout. Lena's hand rested on his shoulder, her voice a steady anchor. Now, Alex, full power, now. Alex slammed the final command home. The entire room vibrated with a deep subsonic hum as the massive communication array powered up to its maximum output. A wave of energy, invisible and silent, shot out from the station. A broadcast on a frequency no one had ever thought to use as a weapon. The main door blew inward in a shower of molten slag and smoke, just as the transmission reached its peak. Draki security forces stormed into the room, weapons raised. They were too late. The signal was already racing toward the enemy, a final, desperate message from a world that had already died, carrying the one thing that could save a world about to share its fate. On the main view screen, the Harvester Armada descended on Helios Station. Their formation was perfect, a geometric pattern of destruction. Each ship a dark block against the starfield, moving with a chilling, synchronized purpose. The frequency broadcast showed no immediate effect. The bar on the console glowed, indicating the signal was transmitting at full power, but the enemy fleet continued its relentless approach, unbothered. The lead ship's trajectory was a straight, lethal line aimed at the station's heart. In the control room, the Draki security team ignored the screen. Their weapons were all trained on Thomas, Lena, and Alex. The lead officer barked an order for them to kneel and put their hands behind their heads. The fight was over. They had failed. Then the lead harvester ship wobbled. It was a slight, almost imperceptible shudder, like a spinning top losing momentum. Its navigation lights, which had been a steady, ominous pulse, began to flash erratically, a chaotic strobe against the dark. For a second, it seemed to hang in space, confused. Then the formation behind it dissolved into chaos. A smaller drone ship listed sharply to port, crashing into its neighbor in a silent, grinding impact that sent both vessels spinning away from the group. Another ship veered straight up, its engines flaring wildly before cutting out. The perfect geometry of the Armada collapsed. It was like watching a complex circuit board overload and break. The connections between the ships, the invisible tether of their shared navigation signal, had been severed. The entire fleet began to move erratically, like a swarm of insects hitting an invisible wall. They drifted off course, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated. Some spun in slow, lazy circles. Others accelerated on random vectors, moving away from the station into empty space. The station's defense systems, which had been utterly powerless against the coordinated assault, now found easy targets. Plasma beams lanced out from the station's turrets, slicing through the disoriented ships. Without their formation, without their guidance, they were just hunks of metal. The defense grid, which had seemed so pitifully inadequate moments before, was now carving the Armada apart with brutal efficiency. The lead Draki security officer slowly lowered his weapon. His face, usually a mask of grim authority, was slack with disbelief. He stared at the main screen, then at Lena, then back at the screen. The other guards followed his lead, their weapons dipping toward the floor as they watched the impossible happen. The Harvester fleet, the unstoppable force that had consumed worlds, was in a full, chaotic retreat. The few remaining ships that hadn't been destroyed were stumbling over each other to flee the system, their movements jerky and blind. The control room was silent except for the hum of the array and the soft ping of targeting computers. The threat was over. They had done it with a signal, not with missiles or plasma cannons or shields. They had used the one thing the Harvesters never thought to defend, their own navigational heartbeat. The Draki Council had dismissed it as alien superstition, a parlor trick. But on the screen, the burning, retreating hulks of the enemy Armada told a different story. Nellian science, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization written off as extinct, had accomplished in minutes what the station's entire military infrastructure could not. A dead world's final act of preservation had just become a living world's salvation. The ghost of Nelia had reached across the void and fought their battle for them and won. The victory over the Harvesters left Helios Station with a strange, quiet hum, a collective sigh of relief. But in their apartment, Lena found no rest. A deep fatigue settled into her bones, a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. The rich, complex aromas from her own kitchen, which she usually found comforting, now turned her stomach. It wasn't the lingering stress of the battle. This was a different kind of sickness, a fundamental shift in her body that felt both alien and profoundly familiar. She tried to ignore it, to push through, but the nausea was a constant, unwelcome companion. Thomas insisted she see a medic. The station clinic was busy with minor injuries from the attack's aftermath. The attending physician, a harried Draki, scanned her briefly. He diagnosed stress, exhaustion, the expected result of a traumatic event. He prescribed nutrient supplements and rest. But the symptoms persisted, growing stronger. A follow-up scan was ordered, this one more detailed. The results appeared on the screen, and the medic's professional demeanor vanished. He stared at the readout, his scales flushing with confusion. The hormone levels were wrong. They didn't match any known Nillian baseline. They didn't match any known species baseline in the standard medical database. They were an anomaly, an impossibility. He called in Dr. Ela McCoy, the head of xenobiology. She was a sharp, older woman with a reputation for blunt honesty. She ran the tests again herself, her expression growing more focused with each new data point. She looked from the screen to Lena, then to Thomas standing protectively nearby. Her diagnosis was simple, direct, and world-shattering. "You're pregnant." The words hung in the sterile air. Then she delivered the second part. "The genetic markers, they're mixed. Human and Nillian.